The question isn't whether Russia could attack NATO, it's whether Putin would risk everything on a gamble that ends the world as we know it. Right now, as tensions escalate along NATO's eastern frontier, military analysts, politicians, and everyday Americans are grappling with a scenario that seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. The invasion of Ukraine shattered decades of assumptions about European security, and now we're left wondering, what comes next? Here's what we actually know. Russia's military, despite its performance issues in Ukraine, maintains the world's largest nuclear arsenal. NATO, meanwhile, represents the most powerful defensive alliance in history, binding 32 nations together under Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. The strategic calculus isn't simple. Putin has repeatedly described NATO expansion as an existential threat to Russia, rhetoric that can't be dismissed as mere posturing when backed by military action. Yet a direct confrontation with NATO would be catastrophic for Moscow, triggering a response that Russia's conventional forces simply couldn't withstand. So where does that leave us? The real danger isn't a deliberate invasion, it's miscalculation, escalation, and the fragile tripwires that exist between two nuclear-armed power blocks. Today, we need to understand not just the military realities, but the political psychology driving decisions in the Kremlin and the strategic imperatives shaping NATO's response. Let's start by understanding what's actually happening on the ground, because the reality is more nuanced than most headlines suggest. Since the invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, we've witnessed something remarkable and deeply concerning. Russia has demonstrated both its willingness to use military force against its neighbours and the significant limitations of its conventional military capabilities. The Russian armed forces, once feared as the second most powerful military in the world, have struggled against Ukrainian resistance. They've suffered enormous casualties, lost thousands of armoured vehicles, and failed to achieve most of their initial objectives. This matters enormously when we consider the prospect of a NATO confrontation, because NATO's combined military power dwarfs what Ukraine has been able to field, even with Western support. Now, some observers look at Russia's difficulties in Ukraine and conclude that Putin would never dare challenge NATO directly. They argue that the alliance's overwhelming superiority in terms of military technology, training, logistics, and sheer numbers makes any attack irrational to the point of being impossible. And there's certainly truth to this assessment. The United States alone spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. American military technology remains generations ahead in many crucial areas. Add to that the forces of major European powers like Britain, France, and Germany, and you have a military coalition that Russia simply cannot match in conventional terms. The Pentagon simulations of Baltic scenarios, for instance, consistently show NATO forces able to repel and reverse any Russian incursion, albeit at significant cost and with the ever-present risk of nuclear escalation. But here's where the analysis becomes more complicated and, frankly, more worrying. The assumption that rational actors won't take irrational actions is precisely the kind of thinking that has repeatedly failed us throughout history. In 1914, European powers stumbled into a catastrophic war that none of them truly wanted, driven by rigid alliance structures, mobilization timetables, and the mistaken belief that conflict would be brief and decisive. In 1939, many in the West convinced themselves that Hitler would stop after annexing the Sudetenland, that he wouldn't risk the destruction of another major European war. Time and again, we've seen leaders make decisions that appear inexplicable to outside observers, but make perfect sense within their own framework of understanding their own perception of threats and opportunities. Vladimir Putin operates within a specific worldview that we need to understand if we're going to accurately assess Russian behaviour. From Putin's perspective, the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just a geopolitical setback, it was, as he himself has described it, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. This isn't merely nationalist nostalgia. It reflects a genuine belief that Russia is entitled to a sphere of influence over the former Soviet space, that NATO's eastward expansion represents not defensive preparation by newly independent states, but rather an aggressive encroachment designed to weaken and ultimately threaten Russia itself. When Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, Russian officials warned that this crossed a red line. When discussions about Ukrainian and Georgian membership intensified in 2008, Putin made his opposition explicit at the Bucharest summit. The invasion of Georgia later that year sent a clear message about Russia's willingness to use force to prevent what it saw as NATO expansion. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 needs to be understood in this context. Putin appears to have genuinely believed that Ukraine's westward drift, its desire for EU and NATO membership, represented an existential threat to Russian security and to his own vision of Russia's rightful place in the world. The decision to invade was catastrophic in its execution and based on profound miscalculations about Ukrainian resolve, Western unity, and Russia's own military capabilities. But from Putin's perspective, doing nothing while Ukraine moved further into the Western orbit was equally unacceptable. This is the mindset we're dealing with, and it's one that doesn't necessarily respect the rational calculus that Western analysts might apply. So what scenarios could actually lead to a Russia-NATO conflict? The most likely path isn't a deliberate Russian decision to launch World War III. Instead, it's a combination of miscalculation, incremental escalation, and accidents that spiral beyond anyone's control. Consider the situation in the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are NATO members with significant Russian-speaking minorities, particularly in Estonia and Latvia. Russia has historically used the protection of Russian speakers as a pretext for intervention, as we saw in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Now imagine a scenario where ethnic tensions flare in Estonia, perhaps encouraged by Russian intelligence operations. Local Russian speakers begin protesting, claiming discrimination. Russia positions forces along the border, ostensibly for exercises. NATO responds by reinforcing its presence. Suddenly, an incident occurs, perhaps a border skirmish, perhaps a provocation by non-state actors, perhaps simply an accident or miscommunication. Russian forces cross the border, claiming they're protecting civilians from ethnic persecution. Is this an Article 5 situation requiring a full NATO military response? The alliance would say yes, but Putin might calculate that NATO's unity would fracture under pressure, that European members would balk at actual warfare over what Russia portrays as a limited humanitarian intervention. This kind of scenario, what strategists call a salami slicing approach, is far more plausible than a massive deliberate invasion. Russia wouldn't announce its intention to conquer Estonia. Instead, it would create ambiguous situations where each individual step seems limited enough that it might not warrant a full military response, yet collectively these steps achieve significant strategic gains. We saw elements of this approach in Crimea in 2014 with the famous Little Green Men, unidentified soldiers in Russian military gear who seized key installations before Moscow even acknowledged they were Russian forces. The operation was completed so quickly that the international community was left responding to a fait accompli rather than an ongoing invasion. The Baltic states are acutely aware of these vulnerabilities, which is why they've consistently pushed for robust NATO presence on their territories. The alliance has responded with enhanced forward presence, multinational battle groups stationed in Poland and the Baltic states, meant to serve as tripwires that would immediately involve multiple NATO members in any conflict. But here's the uncomfortable question that strategists debate behind closed doors. Would the presence of a few thousand NATO troops actually deter Russia if Putin believed he could achieve a quick victory? Or would it simply ensure that any conflict immediately becomes multilateral and potentially catastrophic? There's also the nuclear dimension, which looms over every discussion of NATO-Russia confrontation. Russia's nuclear doctrine allows for the use of nuclear weapons if the existence of the Russian state is threatened. That's deliberately vague, and Putin has made veiled nuclear threats repeatedly since the Ukraine invasion began. In a conventional conflict with NATO, Russia would face certain defeat if the fight remained non-nuclear. This creates what strategists call an escalate to de-escalate doctrine, the idea that Russia might use a limited nuclear strike, perhaps against a military target in an uninhabited area, to shock NATO into backing down rather than continuing a fight that could lead to full-scale nuclear exchange. Would NATO respond to a limited nuclear use with nuclear retaliation, knowing that this could trigger Armageddon? Would it respond with conventional means, knowing that this might be perceived as weakness? There are no good answers to these questions, only terrible choices and catastrophic risks. It's worth noting that within NATO itself, there are significant debates about how to handle Russian aggression. The alliance operates on consensus, meaning all members must agree to major decisions, while Article 5 has only been invoked once by the United States after September 11th. The commitment is theoretically automatic and absolute, but political reality is more complicated. Would Turkey, which has maintained complex relations with Russia, support military action? Would Hungary, whose government has been notably friendly toward Moscow? Would newer members, or those geographically distant from Russia, be willing to risk their security for the Baltic states? These questions create uncertainty, and uncertainty creates opportunities for miscalculation. The economic dimension also shapes this picture in ways that are often underestimated. The sanctions imposed on Russia following the Ukraine invasion represent the most comprehensive economic warfare campaign in modern history. Russia has been largely cut off from Western financial systems, its central bank reserves frozen, its energy exports redirected away from Europe. These measures have inflicted real damage on the Russian economy, but they haven't collapsed it, and they certainly haven't changed Putin's strategic calculations regarding Ukraine. This tells us something important. Economic pressure, while significant, has limitations as a deterrent when a leader perceives core security interests at stake. Putin has demonstrated willingness to endure economic pain, to accept isolation from the West, if the alternative is what he sees as capitulation to Western pressure. Meanwhile, Russia has been adapting its military strategy based on lessons learned in Ukraine. Despite heavy losses, Russian forces have shown resilience and an ability to adjust tactics. They've improved their use of artillery, developed counter-drone capabilities, and demonstrated that while their military has significant problems, it's not the paper tiger some Western analysis suggested immediately after the invasion's failures. Russian defence production has ramped up dramatically, with reports indicating that Russia is now producing more artillery shells than the United States and Europe combined. This matters for any long-term conflict scenario. Russia may not be able to match NATO in technological sophistication, but it has shown it can sustain high-intensity warfare for extended periods, something Western militaries haven't done since World War II. There's also the question of how changing US political dynamics affect NATO cohesion and deterrence. The alliance has historically depended on American leadership and, crucially, on the credibility of the US security guarantee. When American commitment to NATO is questioned, when there are doubts about whether the United States would actually go to war over Estonia or Latvia, the entire deterrence structure weakens. Putin watches American politics closely. He understands that NATO's strength isn't just military, it's political, resting on the credible commitment that member states will defend each other. Any fracturing of that commitment, any visible division within the alliance, creates opportunities that Russia might seek to exploit. So will Russia really attack NATO? The honest answer is that it depends on circumstances we can't fully predict and decisions made by leaders whose calculus we can't fully know. What we can say with confidence is that the risk is not zero, that the mechanisms for catastrophic miscalculation exist, and that the current trajectory of Russia-West relations creates more opportunities for dangerous confrontation than at any time since the Cold War ended. The invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that Putin is willing to use military force in ways that many thought unthinkable. The question is whether NATO's collective defence guarantee, backed by overwhelming military superiority and the spectre of nuclear war, provides sufficient deterrence to prevent further escalation. History suggests we should be cautious about assuming that deterrence always works, that rational actors always make rational choices, and that catastrophes only happen to other people in other times. The machinery of war, once set in motion, has its own terrible logic. Our task is to ensure that machinery never starts operating, because once it does, no one can be entirely certain where it stops.